Imagine someone wrote a letter 700 years ago describing exactly what would happen to you today. Not a vague prediction, not something that could be interpreted in 1,000 different ways, but a description so precise of your birth, your appearance, your suffering, your trial, your death, and even the exact place where you would be buried, that when you finished reading that letter, you would feel a cold shiver run down your spine. 700 years, stop for a moment and consider the weight of this. 700 years ago, no one in the world knew what an airplane was. No one had heard of electricity. The Americas hadn't even been set foot in by Europeans yet. The world was a completely different place from ours. And yet, someone picked up a pen, dipped it in ink, and described events that would happen 7 centuries later with a precision that defies all rational explanation available in modern science. That someone was Isaiah, and what he described, in a single chapter of the book that bears his name, is considered by many theologians, historians, and even honest skeptics to be the most disturbing chapter in the entire Bible. Not disturbing because it is violent, although it is. Not disturbing because it is sad, although it is also sad. But disturbing because it is mathematically impossible that it was written before the events you describe. And yet, it was. Isaiah Kalima Pulutiga, just 12 verses, a little over 200 words in the original Hebrew. And within that small space, one of the greatest acts of audacity in the religious history of all humanity. The anticipated and detailed description of a man who had not yet been born, of a suffering that had not yet occurred, of a form of death that had not even been invented as a method of execution, and of an eternal purpose that would change the destiny of billions of people for the next 2,000 years of world history. And this is exactly where the story starts to get really interesting, because some people will tell you that this chapter was written after Jesus, that Christians forged the text, that the prophecy was adapted to fit the mold of the gospel. And you know what? That would be a reasonable explanation, if it weren't for an astonishing archaeological discovery that occurred in 1947, on the shores of the Dead Sea, inside a dusty cave forgotten for centuries, by a simple Bedouin goat herder who was just looking for a lost sheep in the desert. What that shepherd found that day forever changed the debate about Isaiah 53. That discovery silenced critics. It shattered theories. It dismantled decades of skeptical academic thought. And today, anyone who honestly studies the history of that chapter must grapple with what that boy pulled from inside that cave. And that's what I want to show you today. Not based on personal opinion, not based on religious sentiment, not based on emotion, but based on historical, archaeological, and textual evidence that is available to anyone in the world who wants to investigate with an open mind. I will present you with the specific marks that Isaiah left about the Messiah 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And you yourself will come to your own conclusion as to whether this could be coincidence, fraud, or something truly supernatural happening right before your eyes. But let me tell you one thing, after watching this video to the end, you will never be able to read the Bible the same way again. This chapter has the power to break down entire walls of doubt that intelligent people have carried for decades. It has been doing this for centuries, with Jewish rabbis, with staunch atheists, with scientists, and with skeptics who one day decided to simply look at the text without fear, without pride, and without an agenda. So take a deep breath, grab your coffee, your water, your Bible if you have one nearby, and stay with me until the very end. Because what you are about to discover now may literally be the missing piece for you to understand who Jesus really is, and why billions of people around the world give their entire lives for this man. Before we dive into this investigation, I need to ask you 2 quick things. First, if you're here now, you're already part of a family that's growing every day. A community of people who aren't satisfied with superficial answers, who don't accept shallow explanations, and who love to dig deep into the Word of God, searching for the gold hidden there. I want you to feel part of this family, because this channel isn't mine, it's ours. So, leave your like now, even before continuing to watch. This like takes 2 seconds, but for me it represents the fuel that keeps all this going. I spend entire days studying ancient manuscripts, comparing translations, reading Hebrew commentaries, putting together each video with the utmost care, and all I ask in return is this small gesture. And if you're not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button now and activate the bell, because the next videos will delve even deeper into these mysteries, and I don't want you to miss anything. Welcome to the family. Let's go back in time. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine Jerusalem in the year 740 BC, 740 years before the birth of that baby in Bethlehem. The Assyrian Empire is at the height of its devastating power. The kingdom of Israel is divided in 2. God's people are in deep spiritual crisis. And in one of the royal courts of Judah lives a man named Isaiah, son of Amoz. He is not just any prophet. According to ancient rabbinic tradition, he is a direct cousin of King Uzziah. He has access to the palace. He advises kings and influences state decisions. And he has a characteristic that will forever change the religious history of the world. He receives direct visions from God. For decades, Isaiah prophesied. He warned the people about impending invasions. He spoke of judgments, exiles, and restoration. But amidst all this, he began to speak of someone who was to come, a servant, a specific man. And when he reaches chapter 53 of the book that bears his name, Isaiah pours onto the scroll one of the most detailed and disturbing passages ever written in the history of world religions. Now, here's a detail that many people don't know and that needs to sink in very clearly. For centuries, skeptics had a very powerful trump card to use against Christians. They would say, okay, this text from Isaiah is incredible, but how can you prove that it was actually written before Jesus? Perhaps it was written later and attributed to Isaiah. Perhaps it's a pious fraud concocted by early Christians to convince the Jews. And this was a very difficult objection to answer. Because until 1947, the oldest copies of the book of Isaiah that we had available dated from around the year 900 AD, that is, almost 1,000 years after Jesus lived. So, in theory, one could argue that during all those centuries of manual copying and recopying, the scribes could have adjusted the text to fit the life of Jesus. It wasn't an absurd theory, it was a plausible one. But then the unthinkable happened. On a hot morning in 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ethdib was tending his flock near the Dead Sea. In that dry and arid region that separates Israel from Jordan, one of his goats strayed and entered a cave. To try to lure the animal out, he threw a stone into the opening, and instead of hearing the sound of the stone hitting the rock, he heard something quite different. He heard the sound of pottery breaking. Curious, he entered the cave, and what he found inside was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. Ancient sealed clay jars containing scrolls of parchment preserved by the extremely dry desert climate. These scrolls would forever be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them, one particular scroll stood out. A giant scroll, more than 7 meters long, when fully unrolled. This scroll contained the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters from the first word to the last. It became known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, or by the technical code 1 Kisa. And now for the chilling part. Through rigorous scientific testing, including carbon-14 dating performed by independent laboratories around the world, this scroll has been dated to around the year 125 BC. Did you grasp what this means? This scroll is over 100 years older than Jesus of Nazareth himself. It was written more than a century before Mary was even born. And when scholars began comparing that 2,150-year-old scroll with the medieval copies we had before, they were shocked. The text was practically identical. The few variations were orthographic. The content of Isaiah 53 was there, in ancient Hebrew, exactly as we know it today, more than a century before the birth of Christ. The theory of Christian fraud died that day, inside that cave forever. It can't be recycled, it can't be repackaged. It's buried. Now answer me in the comments below, and I want to read each and every response. Had you ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Comment below where you're watching this video from, and if this archaeological discovery is new to you, I want to see how many corners of the world people are accessing this content from. Comment below. I got this far. And look how interesting. This means that when Jesus walked in Galilee, when he walked the streets of Jerusalem, when he entered the temple, the text of Isaiah 53 had already existed for centuries. It was already being studied by rabbis. It was already being debated in synagogues. People knew that chapter, and even more. Many rabbis, centuries before Christ, interpreted that passage as being about the future Messiah of Israel. I'll show you this in more detail shortly, but keep this information in mind because it's extremely important. What many people consider a Christian interpretation of the passage is, in fact, the original Jewish interpretation, predating Jesus, the church, and any supposed apologetic agenda. The ancient rabbis themselves read it and said, "This speaks of the Messiah who is to come." It was only after Christ, when Christianity began to use this passage to powerfully evangelize Jews, that the rabbinical interpretation began to change. But that's a topic for the next section. Now comes the most dense part of our study. I'm going to take you inside Isaiah 53, mark by mark, detail by detail. Grab your Bible, open to this chapter, and follow along. I want you to see with your own eyes the surgical precision of this text. The first clue begins right in the first verses. Isaiah writes, "For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, but no beauty that we should desire him." Stop and think. The Jewish Messiah, in the popular expectation of Jesus' time, was to be a warrior king, an imposing conqueror, someone with an impressive presence, with majestic beauty, with the appearance of a world leader. But Isaiah describes exactly the opposite. He describes someone ordinary, without a striking appearance, someone who would grow in obscurity, like a root out of dry ground. And when you open the Gospels, what do you see? Jesus growing up in Nazareth, a town so insignificant that Nathanael even asked, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Don't you find it strange that Isaiah described just that, 7 centuries earlier? The second clue is in verse 3. Isaiah writes, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem." This verse is surgical. It is not the portrait of a triumphant Messiah crowned with gold. It is the portrait of someone rejected by his own people. And what did John write about Jesus in his gospel? He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. The language is practically superimposed, 7 centuries earlier. The third mark is in verse 4. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. This is pure substitutionary theology. The idea that this servant would bear the pain of others, not his own. And look at this interesting thing. Matthew, in chapter 8 of his gospel, quotes precisely this verse from Isaiah when describing Jesus healing the sick. Matthew recognized the fulfillment. The authors of the New Testament did not invent the connection. They saw it before their very eyes. The fourth mark, in verse 5, is perhaps the most disturbing of all. Isaiah writes, "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." Now I need you to pay close attention here. The Hebrew word used for wounded is the word makola, which carries the sense of being pierced, transfixed, crossed, and the word crushed is meduka, which describes something crushed by brutal blows. Isaiah is describing, in the 8th century BC, someone who would literally be pierced and crushed. Here comes the chilling detail. Crucifixion as a Roman method of execution didn't even exist when Isaiah wrote this. The Romans wouldn't begin using the cross as an instrument of torture and public execution until centuries later. The standard Jewish form of execution was stoning, not piercing. And yet Isaiah accurately describes the act of being pierced. When you read John chapter 19, you find the description of Jesus' crucifixion, and specifically the detail of the nails that pierced his hands and feet, and the spear of the Roman soldier Longinus that pierced his side, exactly as Isaiah had described 700 years earlier. Pause the video now and answer below. Which of these details prophesied by Isaiah has impressed you the most so far? The one about ordinary appearance, the one about rejection, or the one about the piercing? Comment below with the number of the mark that moved you the most. I want to read all the answers and respond to as many as I can. And if you have a skeptical friend who says the Bible is a fraud, tag them in the comments now, because this video could change their life. The fifth mark is in verse 7, and it is absurdly specific. Isaiah writes, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." Think about it. Anyone who is unjustly accused tends to defend themselves. It's human instinct. It's a reflex. You shout, you protest, you struggle. But Isaiah describes someone who, faced with an unjust accusation, will remain silent, without defending themselves, without retaliating. And what happened at Jesus' trial before Pilate? Matthew chapter 27, verses 12 to 14, describes the scene almost literally. Jesus is accused by the priests. Pilate asks if he will not answer, and Jesus remains silent. Pilate is astonished, because this was abnormal. This was against human nature. But it was exactly what Isaiah had prophesied. The sixth mark. In verse 8, he was taken away from oppression and judgment, and who can recount his descendants? This verse describes an unjust trial, a premature death, without recorded descendants. And that is exactly how Jesus died. Single, childless, at the height of his youth, condemned in a trial that even Pilate recognized as unjust. The seventh mark, in verse 9, is perhaps one of the most surprising, and they made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. This is extremely strange. How can a person be buried with the wicked and with the rich at the same time? It seems contradictory. It seems like a translation error, but then you open the Gospels. Jesus was crucified between two thieves, that is, between the wicked, but when he died, Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man according to the text of Matthew 27, asked Pilate for Jesus' body and buried it in his own newly hewn tomb in the rock. A rich man's tomb. 7 centuries earlier, Isaiah described a situation that seemed contradictory, and which was fulfilled exactly, to the letter, in Jesus' funeral. The eighth mark, in verse 10, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief, when his soul shall make an offering for sin." Here you have the clearest substitutionary theology ever written in the Old Testament. The idea that the suffering of this servant would be an offering for the sins of others. And that is precisely the heart of the gospel message. The ninth mark, still in verse 10, "He will see his offspring and prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand." Wait, how can it be he will see his offspring and prolong his days, if it was just said that he would die? There is only one possible answer to this apparent contradiction: resurrection. Isaiah is describing a servant who dies, but who will somehow live again to see the fruits of his sacrifice. And that is exactly what Christianity has proclaimed for 2,000 years. The 10th mark, in verse 12, "Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors." Jesus was crucified between two transgressors, two criminals. He was literally numbered with the transgressors. 7 centuries earlier, I could go on, because there are even more details. But these 10 points are enough for any honest person to stop and think. Quickly, if you've been blessed by this study up to this point, do one simple thing for me, who is now part of this family. leave a like on this video. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to this channel. This is the fuel that allows me to continue producing in-depth and free content for you every week. And if you're not yet subscribed, hit the button now. It's just one click. We're in this together. Now we need to confront the difficult question. The one that skeptics ask, the one that modern rabbis try to answer, the one that will inevitably come from your atheist neighbor sooner or later. If Isaiah 53 is so clear, so precise, so detailed about Jesus, why do Jews today generally not accept that it is about him? The answer is fascinating and involves a historical twist that few people know about. For centuries before Christ, and even for some centuries afterward, the prevailing rabbinical interpretation of Isaiah 53 was messianic. That is, the ancient rabbis read that chapter and said, "This speaks of the Messiah." I'm not making this up. And anyone can verify it by consulting the Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel, which is one of the oldest Aramaic translations of the Old Testament, written around the 1st century. This Targum begins chapter 53, literally like this: "Behold, my servant, the Messiah, shall prosper." In Hebrew, in Aramaic, by the rabbis themselves, before there was a Christian church with power, the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin folio 98b, also associates this passage with the Messiah. Rabbis such as Moshe Alshik in the 16th century still wrote, "Our rabbis," by common agreement, accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the Messiah king. So what happened? Why has most of modern Judaism reinterpreted this chapter, saying that the suffering servant is not the Messiah, but rather the people of Israel themselves suffering collectively? The collective reinterpretation began to gain traction primarily from Rabbi Rashi in the 11th century. Amidst medieval persecutions and the growth of Christianity in Europe, it was an apologetic response. Faced with the force with which Christians were using this passage to evangelize Jews, medieval rabbis needed an alternative answer, and that alternative was this: the servant is Israel. But this interpretation has serious problems. I'll list the main ones for you. First problem: the text says that the servant suffered for the transgressions of my people. If the servant is the people of Israel, then Israel would suffer for the transgressions of Israel, which makes no grammatical or theological sense. The text clearly distinguishes between the servant and the people. Second problem: the text says that the servant did not commit violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. No entire nation in history, nor Israel, can honestly be described in this way. This verse can only describe a righteous individual, not an entire people with their moral ups and downs. Third problem: the text says that the servant dies, and then will see his offspring. He will prolong his days. Israel as a nation never died collectively, only to be resurrected. This only makes sense when applied to an individual. Fourth problem: the text says that the servant is handed over voluntarily, without opening his mouth, in absolute silence before his oppressors. Jewish history is full of righteous protests, cries for justice, heroic laments. Israel has never been silent in the face of its persecutions, nor should it be. This describes a different reality. Fifth problem: the text says that through the suffering of this servant, many will be justified. Israel's suffering never justified the Gentiles, but the sacrifice of a single Jewish Messiah could justify many, including Gentiles, and that is exactly what Christianity proclaimed. Now tell me in the comments, did you know that for centuries Jewish rabbis themselves read Isaiah 53 as being about the Messiah? Is this new information for you? Comment below. I didn't know if this part impacted you. And if this information helped you in any way, share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. You could be the instrument God uses to open someone else's eyes. And there's another layer to this story that needs to be told. There are documented records of modern rabbis in the 20th and 21st centuries who converted to Christianity precisely after studying Isaiah 53 without bias, without community pressure, without the filter of later tradition. They opened the text. They read it with the eyes of what is written, and they couldn't reach any other conclusion. One of the most famous cases is that of Rabbi Yechiel Lichtenstein in 19th century Hungary, who was a respected rabbi, a profound scholar of the Talmud, and who converted after reading Isaiah 53 in an edition that a Christian friend had left hidden in his library. He reported that when he read the chapter, a light began to shine in his soul, and he understood for the first time that it could only be about Jesus of Nazareth, and it wasn't just him. There's Rabbi Isaac Lichtenstein, Rabbi Leopold Kohn, Rabbi Max Wertheimer, all historical figures, all with available written works, all who converted specifically because of the overwhelming weight of Isaiah 53. These men had everything to lose. They lost family, they lost status, they lost community, they were called traitors. And yet, they went ahead, because the evidence was too strong to ignore. There's one thing that needs to be said before we close this investigation. People often hear biblical prophecies and think, oh, it's luck, coincidence. Someone wrote something vague, and then they fit it in. But Isaiah 53 is not vague. It is specific, detailed, and measurable. In his classic book **Science Speaks**, mathematician and scientist Peter Stoner calculated the statistical probabilities of a single person fulfilling just 8 specific Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. His result was 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's a number with 17 zeros after the 1. To visualize it, it's roughly like taking the entire state of Texas, covering it with a layer of 50-cent coins, 90 centimeters deep, marking a single coin with red ink, throwing that coin into the middle of the pile, and mixing it well, blindfolding a blind person, releasing them in Texas and asking them to walk wherever they want. Bend down once, pick up a single coin, and it being the marked coin. That's the probability. Isaiah 53 doesn't just have 8 marks, it has dozens. Considering all the details, multiply that by all the other messianic prophecies in the Old Testament about the exact place of birth, about David's family lineage, about the type of death, about the division of garments, about the 30 pieces of silver, about the resurrection. The mathematical probability of a single person fulfilling all of that by chance is so small that scientifically it cannot be called a coincidence. Isaiah 53 is, in other words, a signature, a divine signature etched into history. Proof left for anyone with the courage and intellectual honesty to open and investigate it. Perhaps you're watching this video today carrying a doubt that's been gnawing at you for a long time. Maybe you love Jesus, but someone in your family, at work, at college, threw that phrase in your face. But how can you be sure he was the Messiah, and you didn't know how to answer? You felt the ground shake. I want you to leave this video today with a new certainty. Not an emotional certainty, but an intellectual, rational certainty, based on text, based on archaeology, based on history. 700 years before the birth of Jesus, a Hebrew prophet named Isaiah described with supernatural precision every detail of what would happen to him. This is not a coincidence. This is not fraud. This is God signing his own receipt. And if God cared so much about you that he left this proof etched in history 7 centuries ago, hidden in a desert, miraculously preserved in a cave, discovered at the right moment by some random goat herder, so that it could reach your eyes today, it is because he loves you deeply. He knows you by name. He knows your pain. And the suffering described in Isaiah 53 was for you, for your transgressions, for the punishment that remained upon him, for your wounds from which you were healed. Let your response today simply be, Lord, I believe. If this study has blessed your life today, do the following for me and our family. Like this video now. Leave a comment telling me which part moved you the most. And if you're not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. I produce a video like this every week, always in depth, always with serious research, always free. And it's your support that makes this possible. We're a family here. And look, if Isaiah 53 impacted you, just wait until you see the next video. I'm going to show you an even older prophecy than Isaiah, hidden in one of the most underrated books of the Bible, which predicts with mathematical precision the exact date of the Messiah's arrival. Yes, the exact date. With a calculable year, prophesied 500 years in advance, and nobody tells you this in church. Keep an eye on this channel, because this video will change the way you read biblical prophecy forever. See you in the next one. God bless you greatly.